right, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I know it's been a long time since I've done the lives for everyone here on Facebook, but now that my life has settled down, I want to start doing them again. So we have a long list, and tonight I know that we're listening to the president in regards to the war. There's a lot going on in this nation, and I wanted to take the time to take it back a bit and focus on the good stuff when it comes to our country, our victories, our triumphs, how we move forward, and so on and so forth. So the book I want to review today is a favorite from a favorite author of mine, which is Grant by Chernow. It was an award-winning book, and it was the same author who wrote Washington as well as Hamilton, the musical. The book based on the musical, excuse me. So, interesting about Ulysses Grant is that recently I watched an interview with the author Chernow, and he came up with an interesting point. And the point was, I wanted to find someone who can connect not only the Civil War, but all the way the journey up to Reconstruction. And who better person was that than Ulysses Grant? So this book is very definitive about Ulysses Grant. Even though he wrote his own autobiography back in 1885 with Mark Twain's help, we have the full picture, because Ulysses Grant's autobiography only covers the war, what he wants, but it doesn't cover his struggles, it doesn't cover what he's been through, and it doesn't cover some of the emotional, powerful things that he's been through in life. So I wrote a long report about this because I finished reading this about maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And usually when I read these long books, I make a report. That way I can, when it takes me months to do these lives, I can go back and recall everything piece by piece. So today we're going to we're going to learn about Ulysses Grant. All right, so Ulysses Grant was born in Galena, Illinois, to Jesse and Hannah Grant. So he was born to an upper to middle class family. His father was well known. His father was in the tannery business. However, his father was what's called a perennial candidate, which means that he was always losing elections, trying to run for office, but at the same time, a big name in the small town of Galena. So with these connections, his father gets Ulysses Grant into West Point, and the interesting story about Ulysses Grant is that his initials is Ulysses, or Hugh Ulysses Grant, which is Hug. So when he went to West Point, they actually gave him the S, because the person that signed him up thought that S was his middle name because Simpson was his mother's name. Okay, so he goes and gets the U.S. Grant initials to where it gets him famous within school. So he's at West Point. He's in school with a lot of future Civil War leaders like William T. Sherman, Robert E. Lee, and various other generals that served in the Civil War and other wars like the Mexican War, etc. So he goes to West Point, and then he becomes a quartermaster, which means that he's responsible for setting up the quarters for the soldiers, making sure they have food, making sure everything's packed up during travel, etc. So during the Mexican War, he becomes a quartermaster. Not only is he a good quartermaster, watching out for all his troops and everyone, he's also a stand-up soldier. He stands up to fights, and then he rises up through the ranks. However, if you were in the military like I was, and whoever was in the military, there's a big drinking culture in the military. So Ulysses Grant had a big drinking problem, which led him to resign from the army after the Mexican War. It hasn't been confirmed, but most documents and most first-hand accounts confirmed that he did have to resign at the order of the general's direction. So now that he's resigned and went to the army, now that he's resigned and came back home from the army, He goes back home to his. He goes back home. He marries Julia Grant. Julia is a daughter of a wealthy slave owner. Her maiden name is Dent. So her father, Colonel Dent, is a big slaveholder. So now Ulysses has to come back to be subservient to them, meaning that he has to work for both his fathers-in-laws and then do what they say because he has no money. He just married Julia, and now they're having children. And Ulysses doesn't really have the mindset to run a business, operate a business, come up with a business. So now he's in between working for both his father-in-laws, and at the same time he's collecting, doing side hustles like collecting wood, doing a bunch of side jobs. So now we're in this period of time where Ulysses is kind of lost in his life. He doesn't know what he wants to do, but he knows he's meant for something bigger. So this is when the Civil War starts to come around. He starts reading the papers, he starts taking his positions, and obviously it's the North's position because Ulysses is an abolitionist, which means he's anti-slavery. So he starts in Illinois in the Midwest. He signs up for the militia, and he volunteers to organize militias as well because he was a former quartermaster. So finally those skills come back around to be useful again. So eventually he grows in the ranks. He becomes brigadier general for the Midwest, and then this is when he starts to become famous. The Civil War is in full force, and then and then he starts winning battles. He starts winning Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and with that he earns the name Unconditional Surrender because unconditional surrender was the terms in order for the Confederates to surrender without any soldiers being killed, any jail. So that was his nickname during the war, was Unconditional Surrender. And then there was another series of battles. He was eventually given the commanding general position because I can't think of his name, but the general that was fighting the Civil War had to step down because he was McClellan. General McClellan was not doing a good job up top. So this is when Abraham Lincoln warms up to Grant and decides to make him the general over everyone. So this is when the alcohol rumors start to come again, that Ulysses isn't drunk, that they've seen him lose control at battles. But then they start to find out that these lies that are made up about him are tabloids. Well, he was drunk, but he wasn't. But then they found out he wasn't there at the whole event. So the more rank and responsibility he has, the same alcoholic rumors bring him down. So now that I'm remembering the book, he does have his right-hand man that is in charge of him being sober and in charge of him staying abstinent. So so during the war he was sober, so there was no drinking, only when it was prescribed, because back then it was prescribed as a medical necessity, which isn't the case now. So then we're going to start moving on to the Battle of Shiloh. This is where Ulysses was ambushed. This is where this is where he was cornered. And this is one of the biggest tests of the Civil War, because once you move past the Shiloh area, you start dominating a lot of the eastern theater of the South. So you have the Battle of Shiloh where Grant was ambushed. So the plan was, Grant was in one position, so his initial plan was for one side of his army to come rescue him on one side and have the other side come rescue him as well. However, those guys took forever to come, so his plan was, instead of retreating, moving back, we just need to move forward and keep gaining ground until we can't no more. So eventually, at the last minute, this is when General Sherman, and I forget the other general's name, where both sides get flanked, and then they start regrouping, and then eventually gaining ground, and then moving on to Vicksburg. All right. So then he goes to Vicksburg, and this is where some of the greatest war battles were fought. This is where his strategy made him confiscate resources. This is where they destroyed transportation, destroyed the railroad tracks, and then blocked all the ports, and then had won 5 battles in 17 days. So the Battle of Vicksburg was probably one of his strongest victories when it comes to Civil War. And then after the Vicksburg surrender, this is when the U.S. starts gaining control of Mississippi. All right, which was crucial to the war because Mississippi held all the waterways. Trade was able to get in. The Confederacy was also trading with foreign countries like France and Britain, and they were really close to recognizing them as their country. But the seas of Mississippi really tampered that down. All right, and then the other battles. There's Chattanooga, Appomattox, Petersburg. Chattanooga was another victorious run for General Grant. And then Appomattox and Overland battles. This is the final showdown with Robert E. Lee, because Robert E. Lee was doing great with his command. Even though he lost a lot of people, he managed to last over 4 years when it came to the Civil War. So the Battle of Overland and Appomattox was, the big war, and both sides lost so many casualties, but the winning piece that separated them was General Grant having more resources on his side, more soldiers, more food, more guns, etc., because he was backed by the federal government. So at this time, now that they fought in Appomattox and Overland, General Lee is wearing down and getting desperate. So Petersburg is the final battle. This is where it gets to the point where the Confederate soldiers are starving. They don't have any clothes on. They're fighting with just knives and a couple bullets. And so this is where General Lee and General Grant, they start exchanging letters to start negotiating. So once they start negotiating, this is when they do the famous meeting in Appomattox, when they sit down at the table, and then they go over the negotiations of surrender. And so the negotiations of surrender, at Lincoln's direction, was very, I would say, welcoming. Where they're not gonna, their only condition was to go home, put down your guns and go home. So with that was Lincoln had envisioned a very aggressive Reconstruction and also a light Reconstruction, so that way they can get into the states can get into the Union very quickly. So after the Battle of Appomattox and the signature and the signing, we move forward on. Abraham Lincoln starts to go into his second term, but unfortunately, in April of 1865, he gets shot. And then this is where Andrew Jackson becomes president, who's a Democrat, by the way. So Andrew Johnson, even though he's a slave owner, even though he's from the South, he does support the federal government. However, he doesn't President Johnson does not want to support any black people when it comes to Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau, etc. So during this time period, this is where General Grant becomes General of the Army, and this is when he starts reinforcing Reconstruction, making sure that black people can vote, making sure there's no hostilities to newly elected black folks. So there's a lot of things, and then making sure that the Union is readmitted appropriately. Because during that time in the 1860s and 1870s, you had the KKK, you had a lot of anti-black forces, lynchings, voter intimidation. So this is where Grant really came in and enforced those rulings of Reconstruction with military power, because a lot of those states were still rebelling. They were still sore over the Civil War. So President Grant for 4 years had to hold the country together by commanding those southern states with military force. So during that time, things are not going well with President Johnson and President Grant. President Johnson wanted General Grant to resign his post, then become Secretary of War, in order just to fire somebody. So when that happened, that's when Congress went and passed a law and said, well, you can't fire anybody without our permission. So this is where General Johnson tries to switch Grant's, make him a cabinet secretary, then put him back to general, playing all these jumping jacks with Ulysses. So that's when he says, no, we're not going to do that. And that's when they start falling out. And then President Johnson gets impeached, and then Ulysses refuses to throw his support. And then now it's full on FU between both parties. So now this is the time when Grant starts running for president, because the whole country wants him to become president. They don't like President Johnson. They think he's an asshole. And so the national movement for President Grant starts to grow. All right, and then now that we moved on to, now that we've covered his early life and the Civil War and the years of President Johnson, this is where his presidency comes into play. All right. As president, he still had to enforce Reconstruction. So he utilized the army to still watch over votes and protect the blacks around the country, because, like I said, they were getting lynched. The KKK was really strong at that time. So this is during the years 1869 to 1876, where the federal government and the KKK were going back and forth. But and then with going back and forth with the KKK, this is when he decided to create the Department of Justice in order to persecute these people for the crimes that they committed, because a lot of states refused to do so. So the Department of Justice was created because it was only a handful of lawyers before the Department of Justice. So Ulysses Grant created not only the office, but gave the funding to initiate the office and to pursue those charges. And then we also have the passage of the 15th Amendment. And then we also, another good point about Ulysses Grant's presidency is that a lot of the Alabama islands around Alabama were disputed with the UK. So Ulysses Grant was able to fix that. And then there were also some other things. Ulysses Grant also tried to annex the Dominican Republic. However, there was a lot of racist reasons as to why he wasn't successful. For example, our white government didn't want an island full of black people, and also did not want to be responsible for those people. So we would have had the Dominican Republic, however, it did not come into fruition. And then there was also quite a few scandals in Grant's presidency. We had the Credit Mobilier scandal, which was making money off of government contracts. It turns out there was a lot of the administration involved, and the media used to make media at that time made everyone think that it was Ulysses Grant profiting off those. However, it was his staff members taking advantage of his kindness, because he didn't know anything about these complex scandals, and he trusted the wrong people. Same thing with the whiskey ring, where the big distillers were falsifying their production numbers to get low taxes. That was something that his administration was involved in, and he had to clean up as well. And then another scandal that was under his administration was the Black Friday scandal, in which a lot of the speculators who deal with gold and silver, they wanted Ulysses Grant to dump gold. That way they could drive the prices high. So just like stock markets or inside trade, they wanted him to manipulate the market so that way people can profit. And that was done by his brother-in-law, the Black Friday ring, the Black Friday scandal. So Ulysses Grant is kind of weighed down by these scandals, and over the years he's seemed as a corrupt president, as I would say a inept president. But now that we're about 150 years in hindsight, we realize is that he plays a big part in keeping the Union together, by protecting the passages of the 14th and 15th Amendments, by integrating the southern states back into our union, and then stemming the rise of different racial factions like the KKK, various other racial groups. So after 8 years of that, Ulysses finally steps down. He does get pressured for a third term. However, it ultimately does not come into fruition. The post-presidency, Ulysses Grant was the first president to travel abroad. He set the tone for post-presidency. And when I mean set the tone for post-presidency, he was going on world tours, building relationships with foreign countries around the world, and then also acting as an intermediary in other foreign situations. So solving foreign disputes between other countries, being the middleman, etc. However, he does travel all around the world. He goes to Japan, China, I think India, and other cool countries, Europe, the UK. He was hosted by Queen Victoria, which was cool. I did not know that about him. And then when he gets back home, he opens up a successful business. However, that successful business turns out to be a Ponzi scheme. And so this is where he goes broke. So this is when people start offering him hey, why don't you start telling your stories? So a newspaper gets a hold of him, and then so he starts writing short stories about the war, about his life, and he gets paid. I mean, he gets paid okay, but this is when Mark Twain starts to come in and says, look, how much are you getting paid for these books? And then Ulysses Grant replies, well, they're giving me 20% on everything that I write. And Mark Twain's like, well, that's a bunch of crap. Well, you know how Mark Twain talks. So they come up with a deal where Ulysses gets 60%, and then Mark Twain gets the remaining 30 or 40%, which is way bigger than what he was receiving beforehand. So this happens, I think, around 1883, 1884, because around this time, this is when he starts getting diagnosed with throat cancer. So over time, there was no treatments for that. So we didn't have radiation. We didn't have any solutions for that. So he has to pretty much raw dog this disease. So now he's concerned about his legacy and how he's going to leave Julia and the kids, which the kids are older, but you know what I mean. So he takes Mark Twain's deal. And so what's so heroic about this, about, him writing this book and the situation about this, is that he writes and he writes and he writes, and he finally finishes the book 2 days before he dies. So he dies of throat cancer in July of 1885, and the book is a hit. So the book made millions of dollars for Julia Grant, and it was a great book. But like Ron Chernow, Mark Twain found a lot of gaps in the book, meaning that, why didn't you talk about the alcohol? Why didn't you talk about your struggles? You kept it really war-centered and very rigid. But even though it was a good book, it did give insight on war, what his thought was, how everything, how he talked to Robert E. Lee, etc. So, I think this was a great read. I didn't intend on reading this, but once I read Washington, I was like, wow, I love the style that Ron Chernow writes, and it makes it sound really vivid and like a story, like you were there. It was one of the few books where I was like, oh my god, I missed this book. I missed the people in the book. I missed waking up for a month and seeing what General Grant was going to do, because it took me a month to read. But it was a great book, so I highly recommend. It was a lot to go over. It was a 48-hour book. Definitely filled my gaps in when it came to the Civil War and that whole era around Reconstruction. So, I appreciate everyone joining. This will be up on YouTube since Facebook doesn't keep these videos for long. And, looking forward to the next live.